So today I wanted to do some critical analysis on the period actually the prophet was talking about in this paragraph actually. I wanted to stop while I was reading it, but I don't want to mess up the flow. But the period where he's talking about the Constitution is not changed, and since that Constitution is not changed, it's not necessary for the 14th and 15th Amendment. Here we go, right here. So this section right here is what I want to do a critical analysis on. So the free national constitutional law that was enforced in 1774. So this was before the Constitution. This was before the United States was even called the United States. 1774, we're dealing with a period where there were still the New England colonies. We're dealing with a period where they're trying to escape the tyranny and being subject to the Moors in Britain. But Britain, the British Moors, this is a period where they're over here as subjects and they're trying to get their own thing together. All right. They don't want to be under the finger of the British Moor, King George. They don't want to be under his jurisdiction. All right. So these Slavs over here were going through a transitional period of government. Who had to oversee that transition of government? These Slavs that had no training on how to run government. This is their first time at bat. These pilgrims who had to oversee the transition from them being subjects to organizing amongst themselves, electing delegates, plenipotentiaries to do treaty negotiations. They had to organize amongst themselves before we even get to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. It was prerequisites before the Treaty of Peace and Friendship that needs to be analyzed. So during this period, nothing was called the United States of America. It was the 13 colonies. It was actually the New England colonies at this time. So who was overseers? Who were the presidents before George Washington that was overseeing these pilgrims, making sure they were capable of running government and being independent? Who were these people? John Hanson, all these Moors, right? So this I'm setting the stage. I'm just setting the stage right now. So the free national constitutional law that was enforced in 1774 declared all men free and equal. So I'm highlighting that. So when I get into my demonstration, it'll all click for you. Okay. So now I want to get into this document right here dealing with Continental Congress. Benjamin A. Balog is calling it the Moroccan American Treaty of Friendship. Of course, we know it's the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between the Empire of Morocco and the United States, which is a whole different situation, but they're using connotative language. But we're going to extract the truth out this document. So the Continental Congress in the Moroccan treaty with the United States, turbulence ruled the early years of the United States of America. The new country continued to fight for freedom against the British Empire. The central government of this new nation, the Continental Congress, this is what we're going to get into. Who is the Continental Congress? Who is that? That's the overseers of the continent of what? America. The continent of America had people before the pilgrims were here. It was sultans over here, obviously, right? Uh, so the Continental Congress was the Congress of the people that were here. They were the supervisors over these Slavs. Because remember, how did they get here? It was the Sultan and then the and the heads of the noble families in Britain, England, rather, right? So in this case, we're dealing with King George, the Moor over there, the Christian Moor. The Christian Moor dealing with the Muslim, the Sultanate, Caliph, still ancient empire Moor. Both of these Moors decide what they're gonna do with the Slavs. King 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 George, like, look, man, we got Slavs over here. Can we park them over here? Whatever. They get over here. We start overseeing the transition because what's happening is they still paying taxes, but they really don't, and they want to be their own thing. So we like, look, if y'all want to do that, show and prove that y'all can do your own thing. They like, bet we can do it. We observing. So it took them from 1774 to the time of the Constitution. We're talking about 1789, right? We're talking about more than 10 years. It took them that long because remember they had to study us. Remember they studied the quote unquote Iroquois Confederation to even know to get a sense of how to even run anything for themselves. That's why they called their document the Articles of Confederation, which is a document where they became the DBA, the USA. The 13 colonies became doing business as they called their thing Articles of Confederation. They got that lingo from us. They don't know what a confederation is, all right? So I'm just going, you know, different angles in this time frame just to for clarity purposes. All right, so the Continental Congress. Let's get more into that. I wanted to set the stage. Let's get into that a little bit more depth. So, Continental Congress. Each of the three Congresses held by the American colonies. Look at this date in 1774. Ain't that the date that the prophet highlighted? Since 1774, all men created equal. There's no need for the application of the 14th Amendment. Why is he choosing 1774? This was during a period where the United States wasn't even called the United States. This is why he's saying that. This is why the prophet's mentioned in 1774. Because, as you'll see, who the overseers were, and you see that's the beginning of what you call the transitional period. So each of the three Congresses held by the American colonies in revolt against the British rule. Right? So these Slavs were revolting against the British Moors. The second Congress convened in the wake of the battles of Lexington and Concord, created the Continental Army, which fought and eventually won the American Revolution. All right, so let's get into my focal point is the legislative bodies part. So the Continental Congress was a series of legislative bodies with some executive function for the 13 colonies of Great Britain. See, they weren't even called the United States. There were the 13 colonies there of Great Britain. They was the British Moor subjects at this time. It was nothing called the U.S. But who were the overseers? Continental Congress, which were legislative bodies, because each colony had to be overseen by a delegate of this body, which were the Moors, i.e., the presidents, the 8 presidents before George Washington, John Hanson, right? We get into the era of Benjamin Banneker. Every president was part of a republic that was already here, and the assignment was to make sure these Slavs are ready to run government and then report back. Right. So I'm just breaking it down. Right. All right. So in the newly declared United States, before, during, and after the American Revolutionary War. All right. So now let's go into a little more in depth now. Now that we know that. All right. So Continental Congress. Let's get into the legislative bodies. All right. So the legislative bodies was a deliberate assembly with the legal authority to make law for a political entity, such as a country, nation, or city, on behalf of the people. They're often contrast with the executive judicial government. All right, so this is the role that John Hanson and all these Moors that were before George Washington, they were making laws for them, for the Slavs during this period. Um, let's go to John Hanson. Let me play this slide. Let me make sure share sound. Shares should be on right stereo. Bam. All right.
In 1730 to 1799 AD. John Hanson was the first black president, and John Hanson was a Moor, aka black, and John Hanson is located on the back of the $2 bill.
$2 bill.
Did y'all hear that? Did
Yeah.
everybody hear that? The
Yeah.
audio?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So November 5th, John Hanson the Moor is elected as the first president of the Second Continental Congress, representing this newly formed United Colonies. He is the only president to have spoken under the Great Seal Pyramid. The president of the Continental Congress was mostly responsible with handling correspondences and signing documents. Hanson served until November 4th, 1782. All right, so then we go into the second president, then the third president. Then we got the fourth president, 1784. But peep the dates though. Hold on. Let me go up to 17. Look. So that's the prophet mentioned 1774. We're gonna keep getting into this timeline on why he was emphasizing that. So in efforts to end the constant conflicts, wars, massacres, and the like, we made attempts to usher the Europeans into moral government. Right? So we're trying to get these Slavs to have a noble nature, character-wise and politically in government, as well as guideline for how they were to conduct themselves on our land. So all these Moors before George Washington, that's what they were overseeing these Slavs, making sure they understood the rules of the game in America. The First Continental Congress was established for the struggling Europeans in 1774. Still, many of us did not want the Europeans on our lands, and constant battles and wars broke out. Up until the Declaration of Independence in 1776, British treaties with our empire protected the English colonies, ships from various Moorish attacks, and the like. All right. Europeans paid tribute to us in exchange for peace treaties to end attacks on their lands and naval ships, marked with the Star Spangled Banner, which is falsely called the American flag. So just a little backdrop on this is, pilgrims were running from, they didn't want to be under the jurisdiction of the brutish Moors. They wanted to have something else, another way of life. And they liked what the Moors were doing in the Americas, under the Sultanate. We had sultans, we still under the empire way of life. It was the old world. They liked the old world, right? Of course, it was different levels to the game. I'm giving an overall timeline. So, because these are, questions people, the general public have questions like these because they hear history a certain way. So when you come from this perspective, it's like, oh, you come up with dates, you're dealing with the organization paperwork, but what they're not getting is that time frame before George Washington and all the pilgrims handlers during the process of them forming their government. They had Moorish handlers that reported back to the sultans to see if these people are ready. Y'all talking about y'all want a Declaration of Independence, and but y'all just started bathing. Y'all just started getting the concept of, you know, being cognitive of, as a human in reality, so it was a 10-year plus period before they got even ready to elect George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Barclay, the quote unquote founding fathers. It took them 10 plus years to figure out organization. They have Moorish handlers, right? You need to know that you need to know the timeline like this so you can talk to the people like that and demystify all the smoke. You know, keep it simple as plain, simple and plain, right? All right, so I want to highlight that. Any thoughts, questions, statements on this period?
I remember some Ros Mariah said about the Europeans asking for something, and the Moors said it was some big word, but it meant funny. It's like it was funny that you're asking for this and you don't really have anything set up. Kind of like them putting the cart before the horse. They were like, it was like it's kind of funny you're kind of asking for furniture and you don't even have a house type deal. But
Mhm.
I gotta go find that. But I'm gonna maybe think. But it was like boisterous or some word that the Moors used, but it meant funny. They were saying this is comical that you're coming and asking us that you got a new government and things of that nature, and you don't even have land. But you?
Right, right. And remember the letter from George Washington, which was later. This was later than the time period I'm actually dealing with. But later, it was when they did kind of organize. Uh, George Washington still talking about we don't got nothing. We got slither, gold, and silver. We got little with nothing. We just came off from having a vicious war. We ain't got nothing for you, but I know we owe you tribute, but just stall us out, right? So
Like
that
kind
show
of
you.
saying not to cut your wisdom. Shorty off Friday. Like, hey, Craig, let me borrow your microwave. I was like, so
Yeah,
you don't
yeah,
even gotta, you guys even want to put this microwave? Or are you just gonna run off with my microwave? Like, who asked for
yeah,
like borrow your microwave real quick for a minute, 30 seconds. It's like, huh? Are
yeah,
you got a home for
right. So, or any other thoughts before I continue on this space?
I think it'd be cool to have a visual of this. I feel like people usually just know George Washington, but to have like a timeline visual, maybe have like the flag and then like a transition, like a timeline. I think that'd be kind of cool. Just putting it out there.
Yeah,
People love visuals.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Making it real crystal clear and plain for the people because they didn't see how these was Moors competent. Think about it, because like I say, Benjamin Banneker Bay, they'll just say Benjamin Banneker, but he was in the mix during his time, right? He created the landscape for the Pentagon. You know, um, his intellectual property was in the background of their formation too. And a lot of these people, these George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, which were really mulattoes, amalgamated Moors themselves. Um, they got information from the nobles over here, which gave them the whole idea to do the secret society thing. The Freemasons, right? These was the freed Slavs, the freedmen, but they took it and Romanized it and made it like an order. And see, what was happening was they got infiltrated. These were still Jesuits amongst the colonies. So the Pilgrims had Catholic Jesuits within themselves still, even after we assisted them to get underneath the thumb of the King George. They still had an agenda, and that's later. That's another context, but it's still good to know that because people always wonder, how do we fall? How do we had all these great souls and we was ruling the world? How do we fall? And You know, it's for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is that they'll still pay the Sultan tribute, but internally they'll be still trying to capture the prince of a local area, one of the bays or something, and then separate the women from the children and get them to adopt something foreign so they can enforce the Christian black codes. That's still going on too in certain areas. But at the top, they'll make it look good and still be paying tribute. So it was like it was still war going on. And if you remember, Jamestown like 1600s, the treaty was 1780. So we're talking about hundreds of years before it. And then we had another revision of the treaty in 1836. So it was still sultans over here to almost the 1900s, So a lot of things happen before we just ultimately fail. And then now you start, if now that you know it wasn't that long ago, now you start seeing like, oh, when did they start tagging us Indian? When did they start tagging us Negro? All this was for us to forget, and for them to have action at doing what they're doing to us without having really into international blowback because you're doing it to a stateless people. Um, so yeah, what I wanted to highlight was this provisional government situation. So it says the Second Continental Congress served as the provisional government. So these Moors that were before George Washington and the crew were a provisional government. What's a provisional government? What's their position? All right, a provisional government, also called an interim government, emergency government, a transitional government. Remember, these Slavs are transitioning to the point where they can organize amongst themselves. So a provisional government oversees the transition. It's just a transitional government. Then they're gonna step back once y'all can, do your own thing. Provisional leadership is a temporary government formed to manage a period of transition. All right, so this is just a little cross, supplemental to support my case in my demonstration today. To show you that's what, like I say, John Hanson, all these Moors were just supervisors to these pilgrims. All right, so I've never heard it just as black and white as I'm saying it right now. So it inspired me when I was just going through the computer. I'm like, man, let me just do a demonstration. And yeah, hopefully it was helpful and helped, gave a clear picture for one, why the prophet is bringing up 1774, why he's highlighting that, because this was their origin. They started the process of attempting to get on their feet. You got the Articles of Association, Articles of Confederation, then the Constitution for the United States, is the new entity. Then you got the treaty. That was a period from 1774 to 1789. So most people think, oh, the Constitution was the start date. They just, don't really know history like that. Any thoughts, statements, comments?
In demonstration, you basically told us how the pilgrims are low budget and we're better living. You know, but we ain't got. I saw a picture the other day. It was like, have you ever been so broke where you can't even cover a good deal?
Right.
Kind of how the pilgrims were. They're like, look, I know we all y'all some chili or whatever, but still we got this paperwork we're trying to set up, but they're already like in the hole.
Yeah, that
Oh
part,
man,
man.
and more is being like, okay, it's unconditional love because like on a business tip, like these days, if you try to go get a loan or something, you have that kind of credit background, they're gonna, cancel Christmas on you. Moore's like, okay, but other Moore's around like, hey, I don't think you should be doing that, but no, it's a lot going on in the world. We're taking advantage of them, but most of us or some of us are taking advantage of them. They're just so like we can be better, But basically, you just saying like, hey, they're a low budget. and we are better living. The prophet was showing us they are living off of our virtues. You know what I mean? So, like you.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a good demonstration. I feel like I learned more. I feel like I usually, when I talk to people, that's my meeting point. I talk about the 13 colonies, but I feel like this gave me like more in depth to where I can give more information that people, can kind of grasp and hold on to.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was really good too, brother. You had me
More clarity.
some more detail. Yeah, thank you.
Hmm.
That's beautiful, man. Uh, let me see if I had any more aspects. Okay, so I think today we gotta go over we're going over the treasury today. Uh, it was decided to do it the second week of the month now, since a couple people, it'll be better for them. So let me go into read a chapter out of the Quran, and we can close out and go into the treasury or any miscellaneous questions, statements, comments. We'll make sure everybody got the court date and the location if they happen to be free that day as well. All right, so this is from the Circle 7, Holy Quran. This is chapter 25, a holy covenant of the Asiatic nation. Ye are the children of one father, provided by provided for by his care, and the breast of one mother hath given you suck. Let the bonds of affection therefore unite thee with thy brothers, that peace and happiness may dwell in thy father's house. And when ye separate in the world, remember the relation that bindeth you to love and unity, and prefer not a stranger before thy own blood. If thy brother is in adversity, assist him. If thy sister is in trouble, forsake her not. So shall the fortunes of thy father contribute to the support of his whole race, and his care be continued to you all in your love to each other. Islam. So that was a holy covenant of the Asiatic nation. Unity is a must. Unity and having love amongst the people working together. That is what the covenant is. In the holy books, that's what the covenant is. Keeping the covenant. That's what we're doing. All right, so let me close out in prayer. I'm gonna stop recording, and then we'll go on to the Treasury report and where we're at as far as our land trust. Allah, the Father of the universe, the Father of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Allah is my protector, my guide, and my salvation, by night and by day, through his holy prophet, Noble Joe Ali. Amen. Islam. Let me stop the recording.